Dr. Anthony Pagliarini, why would God want the Jews, or really anyone, to kill animals as a sacrifice to him? Why would killing animals make him happy?
Killing animals doesn't make him happy, but a guy's got to eat. No, I was kidding. This is one of the great misconceptions about sacrifice, namely that it's the death itself that is pleasing, and that is not at all the case. Death is the unavoidable component of something else, which is the rendering, the ennobling rendering of things back unto God. So God is not pleased with death.
So friends, thank you for being here and exploring the Qur'an and the Bible. I'm super excited about this conversation, which is principally going to be about the biblical understandings of sacrifice. I mean, sacrifice has a huge place to play in the unfolding of the Old Testament, and maybe is at the very center of the New Testament. There are going to be references to Islam, to the Hajj, and the sacrifice of animals. First, Dr. Anthony Pagliarini is Associate Teaching Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies at the best Department of Theology in the world. I say that kind of as a joke, but we're actually ranked #1, so it's actually not a joke. It's not funny. It's very serious. Don't mess with us. So that Department of Theology is here at the University of Notre Dame. His office is just down the hall from me. He teaches a great number of students, both in our core courses. Every student at the University of Notre Dame has to take some theology. So in those core courses, and he also leads the way for our large number of majors. We have about 850 majors and minors. So Anthony, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
I was just thinking that, there is a living tradition in the Abrahamic religions of animal sacrifice, and that's in Islam today, in 2025, 2026, at Eid al-Fitr, Muslims will sacrifice an animal as part of the, cultural tradition, but also, an obligation in Islamic tradition around that festival or Eid. So there are animal sacrifice goes on, but in Judaism, for the most part, it doesn't, right? Because there's no more temple. I mean, the sacrifices took place in the temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah. If there were a third temple, I think most Orthodox Jews would be very happy to start up the sacrificial fires again. It's noteworthy that in the north of Israel, we still have a small Samaritan community that does carry out animal sacrifice. To be fair, though, there's a good component of Judaism who has spiritualized the work of sacrifice. And so even if there were a thing like the third temple, maybe sacrifice is best rendered as prayer. And so it's not universally the case that the Jewish faithful are waiting for the return of a third temple to offer animal sacrifice again, although certainly there's a component who are. Yeah.
So Jerusalem temple, you said if there were a third temple, so there's been 2 temples.
Like 2.5. So there's the first temple built under Solomon. Mm-hmm. So we are in the Solomon reigns from, let me get it right here, 940 to 930 BC, roughly. That one's destroyed in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. It's rebuilt in 519 or so when some of the population returns from exile. That's the second temple. I said 2.5 because that second temple is greatly modified and expanded under King Herod. And if you're in Jerusalem nowadays, if you go to the Western Wall, that's the Herodian foundation wall to the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount.
So the giant stones, those are not Solomon's stones.
Those are not Solomon's. No, those are Herodian from King Herod. Yeah.
And yeah, so 2.5, and then that second, the bigger and better version of the second temple built or expanded by Herod is destroyed in AD 70.
In AD 70, yeah. Interestingly, by Titus, who's a member of the Flavian dynasty in Rome, and many of you know what the Flavians built, the great Flavian amphitheater, known better as the Colosseum. And there's a stone in the Colosseum that references the building being built by the general's share of the booty, by the spoils of war. And so there's a case to be made that the temple and its treasury were transferred to Rome and sort of re-erected as the Colosseum, you might say. So nice historical connection there.
So yeah, the new temple for pagan Rome. Eventually, the blood of humans will be spilled there. But speaking of blood and sacrifices, so I mean, what was the temple? Why did Solomon build a temple? And why were there sacrifices carried out there?
Well, if we want to understand the temple, and here you could go to the first book of Kings, it's great dedication ceremony in 1 Kings 8. But if you want to understand the temple, you have to first understand the tabernacle, that portable sanctuary in the wilderness. And for that, you got to go back to Exodus 25, the beginning of a long series of chapters that detail the construction of the tabernacle. But most importantly, right at the beginning in Exodus 25:8, you have God saying, "Let them build me a sanctuary that I might dwell with them." And so the sanctuary is meant to be a site of the divine dwelling within Israel, a place where Israel again, or humanity again, in and through and with Israel, can encounter the Lord face to face. If you want to imagine it differently, you can think back to the account of human origin in the second creation account, the Garden of Eden. God walking in the cool of the garden, face to face with man. You have that interrupted by original sin. And then beginning with the appearance of God in the burning bush in Exodus 3, it's almost like Eden is chasing down humanity. So Eden, that garden ringed in fire, now shows up as, well, a tree ringed in fire, or a burning shrub or small tree, and inviting humanity back in.
So
But
the
in a
burning,
way,
so the burning bush
the
being
burning bush. Yeah.
somehow maybe symbolically representing the
Eden,
garden, a new garden,
a new
different
garden.
but new.
Yeah. And just to complete the connection there, if you think about the way then the tabernacle is built, one of the central items is the menorah, which is carved to look like a 7-branched almond tree and set on fire. It's the perpetuation of the burning bush. And so that moment of the divine and human re-encounter is perpetuated in the tabernacle and then in the temple. But whereas divine human interaction was, you could say, free and easy before the fall, now it's characterized by what theologian Peter Leithart calls a double pedagogy, which is, on one hand, the very fact of God's appearing says, Gabriel, enter in, come in. But at the same time, tap the brakes, take off your shoes. This is a more dangerous entry because of how unlike God you now are, given the fall, given the presence of sin.
So in the garden, before the disobedience of Adam and Eve, humans preserve the image of God. I mean, Genesis 1:26, I think, is a verse which speaks about humans being created in the image and likeness of God. At least God, announcing that and then creating humans in that way. And so, so there's this communion between God and humans. And I really like how you describe then that divine desire for communion doesn't go away, but is somehow different. By the way, I had no idea, I probably should know this, but that the menorah, like the shape, when you see Jewish imagery with this, for me, like candlestick with different places for different candles. I mean, I just thought that's what it was, and something to do with Hanukkah, but it's connected to the image of a tree or...
Yeah, the description of how it's to be built in that long section on the building of the tabernacle, Exodus 25-40, describes it as looking like almond blossoms and I forget leaves, but it's clearly a tree.
Yes.
And if you want a historical image of the menorah, the 7-branched kind of a menorah, again, thinking of the Colosseum, the victory arch that Titus built after he destroyed the temple.
Yes.
It's in the Roman form, the heart of ancient Rome. But on the inside of the arch, you have 2 stone relief carvings, one of which is of the Roman soldiers carrying back the trumpets used for prayer, the shofarim, the table of the showbread, which was another bit of furniture in the temple, and the big menorah. But it's the only historical image we have of the menorah from the Second Temple.
Yes, and it shows probably that the Romans realized this was important stuff, a real prize of their victory over opposition in Jerusalem. Yeah, so the temples there, I mean, I'd like to get eventually to like actually sort of theologically, why would God want sacrifices, or why did things transpire in such a way that sacrifices became necessary? But just to circle back a little bit more on the temple to get things straight here, to get our Judaism and maybe Samaritanism straight. I mean, so you mentioned, Exodus, Israelites get out of Egypt, they're in the wilderness. God basically tells them how to worship Him. I mean, I think this is important too for Islam as well. Like, you
Yep.
don't just make up how you want to worship Him because you're feeling like, oh, I express my love for God in this or that way. No, God has actually told you how to worship Him. And then the way things unfold in the subsequent history of the Israelites is that God said, you will worship me in this city, in this temple in Jerusalem, and kind of nowhere else. That's probably an exaggeration, but I don't know. What would you say about that?
Yeah, if you just to review the way the biblical narrative unfolds, once the Hebrews are out of Egypt and they're encamped at Sinai, um, that little stay at Sinai, which is well over a year, that'll take you from the middle of the book of Exodus all the way through Leviticus, all the way into chapter 10 in the book of Numbers. They finally hit the road. But those chapters, again, many of which are in Leviticus, are divine instruction, among other things, about how to properly worship. The tabernacle is carried along with them through their wilderness wandering and into the land. It gets a little more complex there, but eventually, under David, Jerusalem is set up as the place where God will cause His name to dwell, and David's son, Solomon, builds the first temple.
And then, but just what about like the probably exaggerated caricature I gave of the temple as the only place where one can worship God? I mean, that's probably going too far, right?
Um, well, look
But
at
there's pilgrimages, right? That the Jews have to carry out and it's always to Jerusalem. That's the only place,
right.
right? Because that's where the temple is. That's where God wants you to worship Him.
Yeah, Deuteronomy will speak of things being united in one place. And certainly the anticipation is that there will be, at least according to well, there's the anticipation of one final place. It's going to be Jerusalem. But we should notice that right at the beginning of the description of Solomon, if we're in First Kings, it mentions that he followed all the statutes of the Lord, only he worshiped at the high places and so on. This is First Kings 3:1. And so before the temple is built, people are worshiping here and there and everywhere. And God even appears to Solomon at, I'm forgetting exactly where it was.
Well,
Not
the Ark of the Covenant is at Shiloh at the beginning of
Shiloh.
First
Yeah,
Samuel, so that's not Jerusalem. That's another place.
that's right.
So yeah, but eventually you get to the point where yeah, like in Jeremiah, some of the prophets, folks are saying like, "What are you doing, worshiping God in other places and in different ways?"
Yeah, once the temple is set up as the central sanctuary, to not worship there and to worship elsewhere is then, at that point, to go against the divine command.
So
Whereas
it's
before
not
there's a
that.
temple, it's fine.
So I was going to say, it's not that there's something magical about the geographical place setting of Jerusalem. It's that God sort of made it magical by instructing the Israelites to build a temple, put the ark and the other things there.
Yeah, if there's
I'm probably opening lots of different
no, the
problems
reason
here,
why
but
it's Jerusalem and not somewhere else is never said. It's just that Jerusalem has been chosen.
yeah,
That is the site where I
yeah,
will cause my
yeah,
name to
yeah,
dwell in the temple.
yeah,
Go there.
yeah.
Don't go anywhere else.
And later other traditions develop, you know, even in the Bible, connecting Abraham's sacrifice, which is interesting. Maybe we should actually speak about that, right? Because, okay,
Yeah,
let's take a detour and speak about that, right? Because in the Abraham sacrifice of Isaac's story, there's another version of that in the Quran, chapter 37 of Quran. But in Genesis 22,
right.
it's in the mountains of Moriah where God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, right? And then later on, I don't know where, Samuel, Kings, one of those books, isn't it called Mount? Isn't the Temple Mount called Mount Moriah?
Yeah,
somewhere?
it's slipping my mind where that identification is made, but yes, there is this sort of pious overlay of Moriah and the Temple Mount.
But that could be kind of a subsequent biblical layer wanting to emphasize the deeper meaning of the sacrifices in the temple, and finding a sort of heritage for them in the story of Abraham. Yeah, I'm going here and there. Go.
Second Chronicles 3:1. That's where it is.
Perfect. Yeah, Second Chronicles. Okay, and that the good thing about YouTube is that like I'm forgetting stuff all the time, and even more often I'm misidentifying things. I'm like chapter 5, it's actually chapter 50, either the Quran or the Bible, and then people always have my back or bully me in the comments by correcting me,
I'll go
however you
bully
want it.
you.
You mentioned the Samaritans. I think there may be like 1,000 Samaritans in the world today. And one of their settlements is at the site of the temple for the Samaritans. I think it's Mount Gerizim near Nablus. The Arabs call it Nablus, Jews call it Shechem in the northern part of the West Bank. And it even shows up in the New Testament. Jesus speaks with a woman at the well in, I think, John 4. Yeah, and he says, we will worship God neither on this mountain nor on that mountain being Jerusalem. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, the way the story of Solomon unfolds is that there's, I think with his son or his sons, maybe, I don't know, I'm probably getting it wrong, but there's a civil war, and suddenly some of the Israelites are cut off, sort of, from Jerusalem, and this becomes an enduring theme in the later layers of biblical stuff, right? Because now you have Israel in the north, which doesn't have Jerusalem, and Judah in the south that does.
Right. So the one people Israel, united under King Saul, King David, King Solomon, is divided after that, with the two tribes of Benjamin and Judah remaining in the south, where Jerusalem is, under the house of David. So under Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and his heirs, and Jeroboam splitting away and taking the 10 tribes the north, Samaria as their capital. And that northern kingdom hangs around till 722 BC when the Syrians take them away.
The Assyrians, not the Syrians, not
the Syrians. Yeah, sorry,
yeah,
did I say
not
Syrian?
the Syrian. No, you said Assyrian. I just want to make it clear, just in case, because not the Syrian Arab Republic, but the Assyrians, as in Nineveh and Shalmaneser and Sennacherib and all those bad guys. Yeah. So yeah. All right. So let's finally turn to the sacrifices that did take place in the temple. Maybe a nice way to sort of raise the big theological question is through Christian ideas of sacrifice. There's a lot of Christian language, a lot of Christian videos on YouTube or Instagram reels about, Christ paid the price for our sins by spilling his blood on the cross. That's the payment. Your debt is cleared. Like I hear a lot of Christians saying like, Christ wrote the check to pay, the price, the debt that we owed for our sins. The check cleared. So, you're good. It's over. It is finished. All that kind of business. And that kind of language implies that a sacrifice, so for Christians, that of Christ, but maybe also for the Jews and their animal sacrifices, is basically like you have a debt of sin, and you're, I guess, like, I don't know, if you have a debt and you go to the grocery store because he's, just giving you some apples and potatoes for a while, and written down how many, you go to the grocery store and you pay $50, right? And then it's over. It's just a mercantile exchange. So is that what's going on in the temple? Like people have a debt of sin, and you pay for that sin by giving God the doves or the sheep that you kill there, on the altar?
No. No. Okay. Let me start off with an analogy, and then maybe we'll talk about some of that economic imagery in the New Testament, and then that'll help us get back into the Old.
Okay.
if it were the case that a mutual friend of ours, John Betts, was a soldier in an army and in a just cause, laid down his life out of love of country and love of fellow soldier and so on, we would recognize there's something good there. I mean, so I would say, are you pleased with John? You'd say, well, absolutely. But if I asked you specifically, are you pleased with John's death? You recognize, like, that's a subtle question.
Mm.
You're not pleased with the fact of his dying. That's not at all pleasing. But I wish John were alive.
Mm-hmm.
But I am pleased with the integrity and the sort of the completeness of the gift that John gave. And in that sense, I'm pleased with John's death. And so it's never death as such. God is the author of life. God is never pleased with death as such. But God can be pleased with death in the same way that you and I are pleased or honor our friend John's death. Okay. When we think of Christ, he loves his own and he loves them to the end. It's the integrity, it's the completeness of the gift that is the admirable thing. But as theologians like Ratzinger will say, every moment of Christ's life is filled with perfect charity. But it's only on the cross where that gift is made complete and entire. Okay, but let me just make clear, it's not the death as such that pleases God. That's maybe one point. And this is true of the Old Testament. It is never the death as such that is the thing. In fact, if you look at the descriptions of sacrifice, death is just one step in this whole recipe process. And there's actually much more attention paid to the division of the animal and what you do with its blood and how it's consumed or it's gotten rid of. The death is just an unavoidable step.
But in the temple, it's a death of an animal. You know, like the example of someone dying in war for a just cause, you know, the death itself is regrettable. But does that apply to the ritual sacrifice of animals in the temple? It's not a human who's dying. You know, God loves humans. We're made in God's image. We're rational, all of that. But it's just an animal. Like, we kill them all the time. We eat them.
Right. Okay. Yeah. All right. Let's carry the example forward. What is the thing that we're pleased with in the death of our friend John? It's his nobility. It's his love. It's what he does for his fellow soldier and for his country and so on. Okay. Let's think for a minute about the diversity of sacrifices in the Old Testament. Let me run through the 5 of them for you. There are 2 that are strictly preparatory in nature.
Okay.
There is the hatat, the sin sacrifice, the asham, the reparation sacrifice. And you could think of these 2 as, you know, showering and shaving and getting ready for Friday prayers or Sunday Mass or whatever it is. They're the get ready sacrifices. Then there are 3 others. There's the Holocaust, the Olah. There's also the Mincha, which is a grain offering. And both of these sacrifices are given over entirely to the Lord, or burnt and sent up as a sweet fragrance.
Which means literally the animal's completely devoured by the flames.
In Hebrew, we say the reach nehoach, a sweet-smelling odor going up figuratively into God's nostrils, right? Just a pleasing gift. And then the last one, the shalem, the peace offering or the free will offering, is, again, like the Holocaust and the grain, the Olah and the Mincha. They have nothing to do with sin. Nothing to do with sin. This last offering is a meal offering. So in celebration of this podcast, we might get a sheep, go up to Jerusalem, sacrifice it. God gets a portion and the altar eats the sacrifice, right? So God symbolically eats it. And you and I have to actually eat the rest of it in the temple precincts within a certain period of time. And so it really is a table set for 2. This is all to say, and I haven't forgotten about our example with John, that of these 5 sacrifices, you have preparatory ones that deal with things that might make our hanging out together problematic. We get rid of sin and cultic impurity, so we can get to the real business of honoring God and sharing a table with God. Now, speaking of honoring and sharing a table, if you come to my house for dinner because you just got promoted to university president, I might give you a gift, I might honor you, and I would like to share a meal with you. But on the drive home, you wouldn't say, I had a great time at Anthony's. He killed a lamb. No, you would say, we shared lamb chops. We had a meal together, right? Like that's in there somewhere, but it's not at all a central part of what's happening. The central part is
the killing of the animal.
And the feeding. That's it. Unavoidably, if we're going to have lamb chops, there's going to be a dead lamb. But it's the honoring and it's the feeding, or the sharing in a meal, that is the central part of sacrifice.
So another aspect of some of the Old Testament texts on sacrifice is their detailed nature. And you alluded to this because you were speaking a bit about cutting up the animal in a certain way. I just want to read a little bit from Leviticus. I think Leviticus is when the Israelites are at Mount Sinai. They're getting instructions from God about how to do things, how he wants them. Not only how he wants them to worship them, also laws like ethical laws and everyday stuff. Anyway, so here we go. Leviticus, the very beginning. The Lord called Moses, Leviticus 1:1. The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of cattle from the herd or from the flock. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Verse 5 now. Then he shall kill the bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall present the blood and throw the blood round about against the altar that is at the door of the tent of meeting. And he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. And the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire on the altar and lay wood. Verse 8, and Aaron's sons of priests shall lay the pieces, the head and the fat, in order upon the wood that is on the fire. But, verse 9, but its entrails and its legs he shall wash with water, and the priest shall burn the whole on the altar as a burnt offering, an offering by fire. And then I think this is the phrase probably you already mentioned, a pleasing odor to the Lord. Why all these details? What's going on here?
Where are all these details? Okay. A helpful verse will be Leviticus 17:11, that the life of an animal is in the blood. So again, it's not the death as such that's going to be the pleasing thing, but part of it's going to be the presentation of the animal's life back to God. And where is the life of the animal? It's in the blood, and therefore you sprinkle the blood around the base of the altar and so on. So it's a presentation of the life of the animal. There is also in other contexts, and maybe it's kind of co-involved here, blood is, not to put it crassly, but kind of a divine detergent. So if you look at Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, one of the functions of blood there is you kind of push out the impurity that is built up in the temple, and blood plays a role in that. But here,
that's Yom Kippur. Day of Atonement is what Yom Kippur.
So here it might be the presentation of the life of the animal to God, and then fill it out. Some of it is put onto the altar and rendered up to God as a sweet smelling odor. To be frank, some of the details of the sacrifice, whether it's separating this lobe of the liver from that, there's disagreement about the meaning of these. I think probably one of the more intriguing treatments is Mary Douglas's book on Leviticus. But the rough sketch of what's happening right here is that the life of the animal is presented before the Lord, and then part of the animal is handed over to be rendered up to the Lord as a sweet-smelling sacrifice, an odor.
And I think that, there's also the maybe very elementary point to be made, but probably we're saying anyway, that for the biblical authors, God is telling you what to do, and the right question isn't really like, why should we do this or not? Like, why should the legs be washed with water but not the head or something? Like, no, God is God, and he's telling you what to do. Like, if you're a first grader and your teacher tells you, you do math first and your spelling second, like you don't ask why. You're just, I don't know if that's a good analogy.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. John Levinson is a great Jewish scholar. He's retired now from Harvard, but he has a line in his book on Sinai and Zion where he says, reason is not the sovereign, which is to say, the intelligibility of the laws is not the reason we follow them. In fact, there's probably some that we're shrug our shoulders, but the very fact they're commanded is sufficient. And a second point is the whole of what, as a Christian, I think the whole of what God is commanding in the rites of the Old Testament find their fullest explanation and form and fulfillment in the person of Christ. And so some of the meaning of these rites does come to light later, either later in the life of Israel as you interpret these things in a new way about referring to prayer, or as a Christian pointing to and finding completion in Christ. So the fact that they're a little bit fuzzy in Leviticus doesn't bother me at all. So it's commanded, let's roll with it, and we'll see how it unfolds over the long course of God's providence.
So all of the sacrifices in the temple, I think I started saying it, and then one of these things I started saying, and halfway through you're like, wait, what I'm about to say is actually wrong. So, I mean, we've been speaking about animal sacrifices, but you can sacrifice like wheat or something too in the temple, right?
You can. So remember, I had the two get ready sacrifices,
Yeah.
sin or purification and reparation. And then the two honorific sacrifices, the olah, the Holocaust, that's an animal, or the mincha, which is fine flour, grain, oil,
So,
wine.
yeah, the mincha. Yeah. So in the Cain and Abel story in Genesis 4, Cain offers wheat, right? Or something, some plant thing.
Right.
And Abel offers an animal.
The flock, yeah.
And Abel's good and Cain is bad. Or no, maybe not.
Well, I mean, okay, Cain's bad. I'm not like on pro Cain here, but I know where you're headed. Some people read into this and say Abel's is more acceptable because it's animal and Cain.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Right. I actually think that doesn't hold up. I think it has more to do with the disposition of the one who does the offering. Again, analogies help. So let me just give another analogy.
But animals are more expensive than a bunch of wheat. Like, that's nothing.
Yeah, but that's not it.
Okay.
Let me give you an example, and I think this will help us understand Cain and Abel better. If you and I go to a birthday party, we have a friend, John, whom we really love, right? And because you love John, you want John to be happy. And I love John, and I want John to be happy. So what did you get John for his birthday? Go ahead. You got him a copy of
Frisbee
series new translation of the Qur'an commentary.
Not a Frisbee, yes.
Yeah, okay. John is, he's not that, he just doesn't happen to be that interested. He's got other intellectual interests. Mm-hmm. And so he's kind of like, meh. How do you feel? Okay, you're sad because you wanted your friend John to be happy.
Okay.
Your pride's not hurt. Your main sadness is that you didn't give John something. Then I turn around and I give John a brand new convertible or something. And John is over the moon. How should you feel in this moment? You should be
frustrated. No,
no, you're Cain.
I wanted like my gift.
Right, but you should ultimately be happy because John.
Because I love John. Because I love John, and I want John to be happy. Right. I will the good of my friend.
Exactly. Yeah. But if you're just angry, it shows that the whole reason you were giving a gift in the first place
was about me,
and not for John.
Okay. That's
so when Cain gets mad and kills me or kills Abel, you kind of have the revealing of the heart in that moment. And you're like, oh, I don't care what you sacrifice, Cain. You were doing it for Cain and not for God.
It's an incredible short passage. I mean, the line about sin crouching at the door seeking you out, or whatever it is. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I have another just random reference in the Bible, so there's no good segue here. I'm not proceeding in a logical order, but there's a story in the first book of Samuel in the Old Testament. So this is during a period we mentioned where the Israelites have entered into the promised land, but they've not yet built the temple in Jerusalem. So the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant is in this place somewhere north of Jerusalem called Shiloh. And there are priests there, so there's sacrifices going on. And there's little Samuel who's hanging out with Eli the priest. And then Eli has two sons, I think, who are bad priests. And the example that the biblical author gives of their evil is that they have like a 3-pronged fork, if I remember, and they are, stabbing the pieces of meat. I think it's before they can be burnt on the altar. To a lot of readers today, maybe especially Christians, I don't know, like it's hard to understand why that's so bad. Like, okay, like maybe the guy wanted to be burned on the altar, but why is that so bad? Like, why is that the best example the author could give of their evil? Any thoughts about that story?
I think it's related to the Cain and Abel example. For whose sake are you undertaking any of this? For whose sake? Are you doing it so you can get your extra fat portion from the altar? Okay, yeah, you have to be paid as a priest. A portion of some of the sacrifices goes to you. But for whose sake are you carrying this out? So that you can enrich yourself and take the finest portion? All right, maybe it's a small matter in how much they took, but what's revealed in that moment is, again, it's a revelation of the heart. And this is an entirely corrupt action. If anything, you should be taking less than is your due to give more to the divine glory, right? And I think you didn't quite ask about this, but this is maybe a helpful segue to something it's like a good political answer. Let me turn your question to what I want to talk about. There is a misconception prevalent in a lot of American Christianity, Catholic and Protestant alike, that sacrifice is primarily about removing sin or primarily about death. And if you think back to my 5 sacrifices, you recognize that paying the debt or any sort of just punishment, and that's a whole conversation when we get to the new, but let's talk about the old. That anything to do with sin is preparatory, and that the primary function of sacrifice is honoring and being with the Lord. And I think the example you gave from Samuel, where that is clearly contradicted, right? Where you're taking something for yourself, or jump ahead to 1 Samuel 15, where Saul keeps for himself the finest of the flock from the Amalekites for his own benefit. You see a complete inversion.
Reprimanded by Samuel. Why do I hear these cows
bleeding
lowing
in my ears, right?
and bleeding? Yeah, the sheep bleeding. Yeah.
Right. So I think a lot of the puzzle of understanding Old Testament sacrifice goes away when you recognize what the primary function is. It is to honor God by being like God. It's an imitatio Dei. It's an imitation of the Lord.
But Samuel says I think,
obedience
to
is better
Saul,
than sacrifice. Yeah.
Obedience. I desire obedience, not sacrifice, says the Lord. Something like that.
Obedience is better than sacrifice.
Is better. Okay.
Or you could look for a similar text if you go to Psalm 51, where David is repenting after his adultery with Bathsheba. He says, burnt offerings from me you would not delight in, you would not accept. I'm forgetting the exact terms. But a broken and contrite spirit you will not spurn, right? It's the interior that God desires. But then David goes on to say, in your goodness, do good to Zion, rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and then I will offer burnt offerings on your altar, hosts of, the Holocaust and so on. And you want to say, David, you're contradicting yourself, but he's not. The necessary disposition for offering any sacrifice well is the obediential heart, right? It's the correct heart. But what having the correct heart doesn't just mean we should do away with sacrifice. It means we can then carry out the sacrifice in ways that are actually meaningful and beneficial. And that's
so God wants. It's not that God doesn't really want sacrifices. That it's only a temporary provision, a sort of you have arrangements. I don't know, with your kids, maybe a bedtime at 9 or something. That's not what you really want. You want to stay up and watch TV with you, but it's a temporary situation that's going to pass away. God actually really wants sacrifice. It's just the nature of the sacrifice.
Yeah, think of it this way. Again, I like teaching with examples. If I'm a completely deadbeat dad who doesn't spend any time with his kids, doesn't love them at all, but I throw a nice Christmas gift their way, they're going to say, I abhor your sacrifice, your gift giving. What I really want is a dad who loves me.
Yeah.
But it's a false conclusion to say what the kids really want is a dad who loves them and no gifts. No. They want a dad who loves them and a loving dad who gives them a gift, right? That's what the prophets are saying. Like, look, this vain sacrifice, if your heart's in the wrong place, just take it away. I'm tired of your new moons and your festivals. Go read Amos 5. And he's like, I'm sick of it because your heart's in the wrong place. You're all a bunch of deadbeats.
Okay, so we're speaking about a sort of example or analogy for sacrificial offerings um, via or akin to gift giving. So, Christmas or whatever. But that's not really the story in the Bible, because like sacrifices, aren't they a response to impurity or to sin? And isn't the Bible clear that, there is stuff that maybe Christians today wouldn't call sin because it's a kind of even physical impurity, you've touched something wrong or whatever, or maybe like menstruation for a woman. Like there's stuff that provokes the need for sacrifice. It's not like whenever you want to have a special moment, a quiet time with God, you go and give a sacrifice.
Okay. Ritual impurity is not always a moral category. Here's what I mean.
Okay.
You wouldn't show up to mosque or to your parish in dirty gym clothes, right? Okay. There's a kind of fittingness that has to be present for you to enter into the divine presence and pray. So the question in the Old Testament is, what are the kinds of things that render you unfit? Now, there are certainly some things you can do. So accidental, unintentional sins, and that's a whole category to unpack. Intentional sins like murder and idolatry and the like, they wholesale exclude you and you can't ever get back in. Numbers 15. Okay, but some sin we can take care of, but you might also do some things that are they're not immoral, they're not bad, but they just render you not yet ready to enter into your parish church on Sunday or your mosque or your temple. If you accidentally stepped in a mud puddle, you didn't do anything wrong. There's no sin involved, but you darn well better clean your shoes, right?
But
So
in the Old Testament context,
yes,
that kind of defilement or whatever wouldn't be mud. It would be blood, menstruation, a dog, maybe some sort of impure animal.
Yeah. Okay, so what are the things in the Old Testament context that render you unable to enter in? Now, if we start listing things like sex or menstruation or nocturnal emission or burying the dead or the like, you're going to think our inclination, because in English at least, the language of purity normally implies kind of a moral uprightness. That's not what the word means.
Purity culture.
Right. These things are, for example, burying the dead is a command of Torah, but yet it renders you ritually impure. Being fruitful and multiplying is a command, but yet it renders you ritually impure.
Sexual act still, yeah.
Right. And so again, it's not because these things are morally wrong. Like God's not offended at menstruation or other normal biological processes or burying your dead relative. The reason that these things render you ritually unfit is a God who himself is deathless, a God who himself does not procreate, right? To enter into God's presence is to be like God. So even the priests will wear a loincloth to sort of cover over their genitals, right? Any contact with things having to do with death, whether it's blood out of place or semen out of place, or having to do with sex, these kind of things which are unlike God, who is not procreating and does not die, there's such a fundamental dissimilarity. So on an enacted kind of symbolic level, you say, let me put those things away so as to rightly enter the divine presence. God's not offended by any of that. But to honor the God whom I wish to be like, let me be like him by putting aside the things of mortality and sexuality and death and so on.
And this kind of impurity is unavoidable.
Unavoidable.
Everyone is going to have this. If you're a human,
unavoidable.
You're going to have these.
Not only is it unavoidable, it is often the consequence of following divine command. Think of burying the dead.
Yes. But it still starts the process in motion where you need to have some sort of sacrifice to deal with it.
Yeah, it is. And again, it is not a sacrifice where you're saying, I'm sorry. That is not it. It's something to take away cultic impurity, which is an amoral category.
Okay, so, but there is a moral category as well in the Old Testament. I mean, it's kind of weird or maybe strange or surprising. that the same action, sacrifice, killing an animal usually, maybe weak sometimes, but cutting open the throat and bleeding an animal to death on an altar. I don't know if that's how it was done. I'm just kind of guessing. But that action is the same for the unavoidable, bodily acts of defilement and serious moral impurity, whatever that might be. It could be idolatry, so kind of a religious category, or I assume, other sorts of actions like harming the innocent, obviously murder. I mean, those kinds of ethical things as well.
Right. You can
why
imagine
the same thing deal with two very different things?
what's the logic of the sacrifice itself? What are you doing in a moment of sacrifice? Okay.
And this, with the moral category, if I can just jump in and add in one more thing, I think there's a sense in the Old Testament that this is a problem. This is not unavoidable. This is avoidable, and it's almost like contagious. Like it's like toxic. Today we would say toxic. It's like for the whole community, not just for you. It absolutely must be dealt with. I don't know if that's right. You could comment on that too, or whatever.
No, you're right. There's a sort of, and this is in Gary Anderson's book on sin, there's a sort of thingness to sinfulness. And one of the functions of Yom Kippur, of the Day of Atonement, if you notice, it's like when you sweep a room, you start in one corner and you slowly push the stuff, to the other or to the other side of the room. In Yom Kippur, you start in the center and you slowly sort of sweep everything out. And then you take it and you put it on a goat and you send them out into the woods, right? It's like you're clearing out.
Wait, can you explain that? Sorry. I know I'm like breaking your flow because you're working towards something. But you just explain the goat reference in case people don't, you're like Yom Kippur, goat, like.
Among the things that happen in the Feast of Yom Kippur is a goat upon whom the priest lays its hands. So as some people call it the tote goat, like the bag, like the carrier. So you're putting the impurity that is built up in the temple, either in the worshipers themselves or the place, onto the goat, and you're sending it off into the wilderness to get rid of it. Now the place is clean and we're ready to go again. The place and the people and everything are cultically ready to go.
So right? This is the scapegoat.
The scapegoat. Yeah, it is not. Yeah, I don't like calling it a scapegoat.
Okay.
For that reason, because the scapegoat implies all sorts of different things that I want to avoid.
Okay.
But yeah, you're taking sort of the thingness of sin. And there is this notion that we periodically need to purify the place and the people in it. There's also a notion that certain kinds of sin, bloodshed, idolatry, and sexual immorality, those are the big three, so pollute the land that there's no remedy within the cult of Israel.
Okay. So I mentioned murder, but actually that's a bad example. That's not something that can be dealt with just through
It's not. Yeah. You just have to get out of the land and let the land. Time is the only thing that fixes that one, which is part of how the Hebrews think about their entry into exile and so on. I want to get back to the question, though, of how can this one sacrifice accomplish these different ends?
Yeah.
And again, I'll use an analogy. I think it's very helpful. Let's say that every Wednesday night I have date night with my lovely wife, Katie. And because, at least for the time being, I've been a good husband, date night is wonderful. It's just joyful being together. Let's say in this analogy, and it's untrue, that I've cheated on my wife. And that she in her goodness says, we're still going to have date night on Wednesday. Okay. Now when I get to date night, there's two things happening. I am again playing the role of husband. I'm sharing a meal with my wife. We're doing something communal and friendship building. Only now it's a whole different character. It is, it is both a form of saying, I'm sorry, right? The fact that I show up to date night and clearly in great embarrassment and sorrow am there, right? There's an element of, babe, I'm sorry. So the same one thing that I've been doing all along as a means to friendship now also has kind of a reparation or a atoning function to it.
Yes. Yes.
The same one action.
Yes.
And I think what unites, well, I'll finish it out. But what is that action? It's the action of being a husband towards my wife, right? In good times, that's just joyful and lovely. In bad times, being a husband towards my wife will involve an element of I'm sorry.
Contrition.
And yeah. And if all of sacrifice is a way of being with God, of presenting oneself to God, sometimes it's going to have an I'm sorry element. It's going to be make me whiter than snow, wash me from my sins, and so on. But the reason that the same sort of mechanics work for these different situations is they're all kind of like date night. It does different things at different times. But fundamentally, what's happening is being with one's beloved.
So this brings us back to maybe how you referred to the garden and Genesis, God being with the man there. Yeah, so as maybe providentially placed at the beginning of the Bible to set the tone for the larger theme of God's relationship with humanity.
Can
I
I
wanted to ask though, go for it. I'll
I'm going
remember
to
my question.
close it off though with one
Yeah.
thing. You summarized a minute ago saying that sacrifice is kind of a gift giving. Yes, so long as you name the gift right. Primarily, Gabriel, what is it that you give to your wife? It's yourself.
Yes. Okay.
You might give yourself to her in ways of, a Christmas gift, a birthday gift, a nice action,
Okay.
and so on. But at the end of
Yeah,
the
I was
day,
going to say my time, but
it's
yourself, that's
you.
more fundamental. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
you.
Hmm.
Now, in the analogy here, of course, the primary thing you give to God is you. And if it's the case, if we think back to Genesis 1:26, that the human is made in the image and likeness of God, what does it mean to hand over myself to God? God doesn't want my carcass. He doesn't want my left arm thrown on the altar. He wants me fully and flourishingly alive. And what am I when I am fully and flourishingly alive? I am like the one in whose image I have been made. So the perfect sacrifice is the human person formed in charity, honoring and loving God. That's the perfect sacrifice. That's the gift towards which all of these rites in the Old Testament gesture. So the human person fully and flourishingly alive, loving God, their maker.
I think we probably should not speak about what I'm about to say, but I mean, it does just suggest the dignity of humans, especially. And I know there's all kinds of theologians who like to speak about, ecology and to warn against, making humans better or somehow different from the rest of the world and all of that. But anyway, okay, let's not speak about that. I think it'll take us down a different avenue because, there's all sorts of counter arguments. I was going to ask though about punishment because, I mean, the Old Testament story. It's not that you just someone does something wrong, harms someone, steals, lies, whatever. So that kind of moral impurity, it's not solved only, I think, only by offering a sacrifice. God also instructs Israel how to punish for very particular uh, uh, sorts of sins that lead to moral impurity, right? So that's part of the story too. It's not just a sacrifice.
Right. God is just. Justice is a good thing. But ultimately, in Christ, justice and mercy meet. What we'll say, and for those in the audience less familiar, we view the Mass as the sacrifice of the Mass. And the sacrifice of the Mass as a representation of the death of Christ is both the perfection of God's justice and of God's mercy. Is it the case that because of our sinfulness, we merit death? Yes. Christ does not. Christ is sinless. But Christ willingly undergoes death. But this is the key. How and why does Christ undergo death? Kind of like in our example with John Betts, our friend, the heroic soldier who died. Christ is going to love his own and love them to the end. You might think of the example of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King didn't wake up and say, I feel like dying today. He woke up and said, I feel like telling you the truth about yourself and about God, about your black neighbor, your white neighbor, and about the Lord who loves both, right? Martin Luther King wanted to do that, knowing that the price of loving completely was going to be a bullet, right? Christ does the same, of course. Christ does not seek to die. He lays down his life precisely by telling you the truth about yourself and about God. And in that way, his death becomes a pleasing death. So yes, the demands of justice are met. A human undergoes death, a human to whom it wasn't owed, and therefore the scales, you can take that language you mentioned earlier. But the primary thing that Christ is doing is he's transforming the meaning of that death. It's no longer just punishment. It's no longer only punishment. It is now also the means by which perfect love is carried out in the world. And he'll say to you, Gabriel, go and do likewise. Love your own and love them to the end. Take up your cross, follow me. And so the idea is that ultimately, while you undergo the death that is your due, O Gabriel Reynolds, as a sinner, the undergoing of that death has now been transfigured as an act of love. You, Gabriel, who pour out your life for your students and for your listeners and so on, you love them and you love them to the end. And so your emptying yourself is the perfect form of charity. And so it's both justice and it's also gift-giving, ennobling surrender unto God.
So in the Christian story, the sacrifice of Christ, I mean, this is presented, I think, notably in the New Testament letter to the Hebrews. The sacrifice of Christ is the fulfillment of the sacrificial system in the Jerusalem temple in the Old Testament. So, I mean, that's eloquently, you just eloquently described how that not only kind of brings it to an end, but it is the natural fulfillment of kind of the penal, like criminal laws of the Old Testament and the sacrificial system. That's a random question. It sounds like I'm going to ask something really profound here, but it's not going to be profound. I was just thinking, like, are there Old Testament examples where a human's death is described as a sacrifice? I don't know the answer to that. There may be none, but there are folks who die in the Old Testament. I don't know how Job doesn't die. Are there other examples? Like, is there that sort of expansion of the idea of the sacrifice outside of the temple to human life, kind of anticipating or similar to the Christian stuff?
Yeah. Two things come to mind. One, and this is a thesis from John Levinson, the Jewish scholar. So this is not me backfilling Christianity into the Old Testament. For John Levinson, he says the mark of the life of the elect, so of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, all the way down the life of Israel, is characterized by a death and a resurrection. You can think of Abraham and the sacrifice of his son as giving up everything, functionally dying, but dying in scare quotes, and receiving it all back. You could think of Jacob wrestling with the angel whose life should have been taken from him. Jacob wrestling the Lord, but who received it back. Esau. So
this is, just to clarify this, so Jacob wrestling the Lord, some folks who may not know, I think it's Genesis 32, I'm not sure, but those who may not know the story, like, what the heck are you talking about, Dr. Pagliarini? What is that? Can you just explain briefly? Jacob wrestles the Lord.
Jacob wrestles an Ish, a man by the Jabbok River, a little tributary into the Jordan on the Jordanian side. And he overcomes this opponent and demands from the opponent a blessing. And the opponent gives him a new name, Israel. And then Jacob says, well, hey, what's your name? And the guy says, why do you ask my name? Which, if you go to some other stories in the Bible, like Gideon, that's usually a sign of a name that's too great. And then Jacob sort of freezes and he names the place Peniel, which means face of God, because he
Face of God.
realizes in that moment, I have seen the Lord face to face and yet my life is preserved. That somehow, I'll let the text defend itself, but somehow that this encounter is an encounter with the Lord himself, such that Jacob should have been consumed and destroyed, but yet mercifully he is preserved and allowed to continue. And the next day, something similar happens when he meets his brother Esau. And in that encounter, he says, seeing you is like seeing the face of God. And Esau, who could have taken his life, but again spares him. There's this wonderful overlap. Anyway, not to lose the thread here. The pattern of Israel's life is one of always of death and resurrection. Joseph being left to die by his brothers, or being in prison in Pharaoh. And so there's the understanding that if it is the elect's role, if it is Israel's role to facilitate reconciliation in a broken world, that act, like Martin Luther King, is unavoidably going to involve either death or actual death. And so it's an anticipated. I say to my students, when you get to the Gospels and you see the baptism of Christ and you hear the voice saying, behold, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased, you know the rest of the story. There's going to be a death and there's going to be a resurrection. But as for particular examples...
Because, just to explain, because baptism involves entering into the water and emerging from it, or which symbolizes death and life?
It symbolizes, but even if there weren't any water involved, the very fact of Christ being called the beloved Son, you would think, aha, I know what happens to the beloved, to the elect. They always die and resurrect.
Okay, because so that would draw a straight line to the stories of the Old Testament, where those with whom God forms covenants, they go through this experience.
Yeah, and God will call Israel his firstborn son, right, his beloved. Exodus 4:22. But as far as
even it's just this random reference. I'm sorry, I'm jumping in here, but there's a story in the Qur'an in chapter 2, which is known as Surah al-Baqarah. But there's a story which is actually connected in a text, like a deuterocanonical or extra text, about Jeremiah, where this guy he falls asleep for a really long time, wakes up, his donkey's still there, and he sees the city is unchanged or something. And before he falls asleep, he says, is God able to bring this city back to life? Something like that. Folks will help me out probably in the comments. But anyway, in the biblical subtext to that Quranic phrase, it's about the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, as you mentioned, BC. And then the return of the exiles in the rebuilding of the city. So there's a connection between that story and the resurrection of the body.
Yeah, and you have the same thing in Ezekiel 37, which is the Valley of Dry Bones, which is about the Kol Beit Israel, the whole house of Israel, being brought back to life. So the people, and with them the city, being brought back to life. And so again, this is kind of the standard trope in the Old Testament, which the New Testament providentially picks up on and says, look, it happened in the quintessential Jew, Yeshua from Nazareth, right?
Okay, now I want to get to one more thing before we wrap up, just like to challenge that a little bit. Go ahead.
Also, if you want a specific example of a person who dies, look at Isaiah 52:53, the servant songs, by whose stripes we are healed. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, all of this, like, this question emerges from this beautiful reflection on the deeper sense of sacrifice that one finds in stories in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. But I have this sense that there is a different way of approaching the temple and the temple sacrifices. We've been speaking a lot about kind of communion, basically being with God, sharing a meal with God, the dignity of the human, the story of God walking in the garden with Adam, anticipating that sort of elevated status of the human as God's beloved. But I mean, certainly others might approach all of this and say, no, like the sacrificial system is ultimately about God as creator, Lord, and master, and humans as humble servants who, Islam, for example, speaks of submission, right? The Arabic word Islam means submission. Muslims like to speak about themselves in Arabic as an abd, a servant of God, even a slave of God. I mean, that's a very different vibe, but isn't that an equally legitimate way to think about the whole, demand that you sacrifice to me? I mean, it's not God offering sacrifices, burning things so you can have a pleasing odor. You burn things that he can have the pleasing odor.
Yeah, I think the Christian would say, we are slaves for Christ. And so the language of master and of slave, although it requires some qualification, it's there. The question I would ask is, well, what is it that the master desires? And so if, as a Christian, I say that the Lord, my master, desires that I should flourish and have life and should enjoy communion with him, it's not because I've turned the religion to make it something about Anthony. It's rather that my Lord and Master, and in obedience to my Lord and Master, what is it that he desires? He gets to stipulate the terms. And if what my Lord and Master desires is that I should experience the beatific vision, the fullness of truth and beauty and goodness and unending bliss with him forever, so be it. If he desired something else, so be it. But in the actual order of God's providence, what the good master has desired is that we share table with him in the wedding feast of the Lamb in full bliss for all eternity. So great. So that's what I'm going to carry out. Not because I made it up or because I want it for my sake, but precisely as a slave to the Lord, as a servant of the Lord, as one who submits to the Lord. I honor that desire, which is his desire, not mine. And so be it.
Yeah, beautiful. Dr. Pagliarini, thank you so much for, hopefully not for the last time, for joining me on Exploring the Quran and the Bible. Friends, there will be links to more resources in the description of the video below. Did I forget to ask you something, or do you have a last word about any of the topics here?
Well, I'll leave you with just one good quote, which is Augustine's definition of sacrifice. The true sacrifice, this is from his book, The City of God. The true sacrifice is every act done in order that we might cling to God in holy fellowship. That is, every act which is referred to the final good in which we can be truly blessed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pagliarini.
Thank you.
And friends, thank you. Thank you for being here. Subscribe, like, share, spread the good news of exploring the Quran and the Bible. And until next time, bye-bye.